Education, a basic necessity essential for children to grow and adapt to a constantly growing and changing world. There is no greater benefit to a child than education, whether it be developing technical skills for the future, developing relationships and social skills, or developing a stronger sense of their place in the world. So what happens when education is ripped away from a child?
Before the turmoil of civil war in Syria, children's education was happening at an exceptional rate. 97% of children were enrolled in schools. The government encouraged children's enrollment by dedicating 5.1% of the GDP to education. The government positioned itself at the forefront of education, taking part in the administration, planning, and supervision of the education system. But all of that changed with civil war.
With the violence and horrifying bloodshed that ensued, Syrian children watched as their worlds changed before their very eyes. Enrollment dropped down to 30% and continues to drop as the violence gets worse. Cities like Aleppo only have 6% enrollment rate. At least a quarter of Syrian schools have been reduced to rubble or taken over by military and rebel forces. Out of the 4 million refugees spilling into their countries, 1.4 million are school-aged children in desperate need of an education. So, how are other countries dealing with the Syrian refugee education?
Lebanon. Before accepting 500,000 Syrian children into the country, the Lebanese education system had under a 50% enrollment rate within its own population. With an added burden of Syrian children, the education system is severely underfunded. Syrian children often face abuse and bullying if they are even able to pay enrollment fees in Lebanese schools.
Turkey. Turkey has focused on developing schools in designated refugee camps. Unfortunately, most of the refugee population has moved out of the camp and into large urban areas that lack the space or resources to accommodate Syrian students. Turkey requires several documents to enroll, often including a birth certificate. A legal residency forms are obtainable through a long drawn-out request process that leaves children out of school for months.
Jordan. Syrians in Jordan are faced with similar problems. They lack the proper service codes required to enroll in public schools. The schools that are provided for Syrians specifically lack funding and even teachers. Funding is the biggest issue, and all of these countries simply need more resources to be able to educate the combined million of Syrian refugees in their respective nations. On top of this, the language and cultural boundaries that exist between Syrians and the people of these countries have made it challenging to establish courses that meet both sets of standards in each culture and are taught in both the country's language and Arabic.
Without intervention, Syrian children are at risk.
Child labor.
Human trafficking.
Radicalization.
Poverty.
The future of Syrian refugee success and the success of Syria depends on education. Keeping education alive means keeping alive the idea for a better future, free from a constant cycle of instability.
How do we help? We analyze scope of barriers to access and develop plans to address them. We invest in building capacity for governments to manage the crisis into the future. We include longer-term development planning in addition to humanitarian responses. But most importantly, remember, we do not ignore education needs of children in crisis.